Supreme Court has greenlit the Trump administration to launch their plans for mass layoffs and reorganizations at federal agencies. The High Court lifted an order from a lower court which temporarily blocked the dismissal plans of thousands of workers. These changes are set to affect 19 agencies and departments, including the State Department and the Social Security Administration.
And now Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is slamming the ruling and condemning her colleagues who decided in favour of it. Jackson called the order a wrecking ball in a scathing 15-page dissent. She also says recent rulings by the court's conservative majority pose, quote, an existential threat to the rule of law.
Others on social media had different views about the decision. Conservative internet personality Nick Sorter writes, "The lazy, useless hacks in government are headed straight to the unemployment line. Major win. Jackson once again proves she should not be on the court."
Meanwhile, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren is railing against the ruling, saying of the potential laid-off employees, those are Social Security workers who help seniors get their checks on time, public health workers who keep us safe, and more. Trump wants to make it harder for people to get help.
We're going to disagree on this one, I'm
imagine
sure.
we are,
I
yes.
am happy about this ruling, but I don't know, though. Would you say that, while I'm sure you're against these layoffs and these reorganizations, I don't know, it is really the argument that the executive of the federal government, the in charge of the federal workforce, has no power or authority to restructure it or to lay off workers? I mean, if that is the case, can government possibly work efficiently? Our government is massive and bloated and bureaucratic. Most people, I know that government is not the same thing as a private organization, certainly, but to be successful and effective in a private market to provide services correctly to people, you have to be able to hire and fire people somewhat at will to restructure departments. That's how large organizations, companies work. If the Supreme Court were to say, no, you have no power to do that whatsoever, I think we would just be totally inept.
But it's not saying that you have no power whatsoever to lay off anyone. It's an argument about the scale of the restructuring. And I do think, although we will disagree on it, that it cuts across ideological lines to some degree, because you are a vigorous defender, I would say, of the role of Congress,
yes,
and of not having an overarching executive. One of the arguments that is made against letting Trump do what he wants in this case is that it would winnow away programs and agencies that have been mandated by Congress to a point where they can no longer do their job. Now, that's the matter that the lower courts have been trying to legislate. The Supreme Court decision that we're talking about has not said, yes, what Trump wants to do is legally right, tick that box, it's all good. They have said, while it has been litigated by the lower courts, this can go ahead. And just briefly, one of the reasons I say that this cuts across ideological lines is Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is ideologically very liberal, is making an argument that I think used to be a sort of old school conservative argument, which is radical change can often have unintended consequences. Therefore, you need to be sure of the wisdom of those changes. She talks about, for example, that the lower courts, that if the Supreme Court had ruled differently yesterday, it would have had the effect of keeping the practical harm-reducing preservation of the status quo. Whereas allowing it to go through is allowing, quote, all the harmful upheaval the edict entails while the lower courts evaluate its lawfulness. So those don't seem unreasonable or even particularly left-wing views to me. They seem like arguments for a more temperate approach while the lawfulness of the thing is being decided.
I mean, I guess I would say in response to that, there's a kind of radicalism to just continuing to let the federal government and the growth of the government spiral out of control. And also in terms of that's a good point to bring up congressional oversight. And I certainly wish Congress was more active and more involved in doing restructuring of government. Yes, I think that would be ideal. The worst case, from my point of view, is just leaving it to the agencies themselves, which will never do any pruning ever. They just want to grow. Themselves. That's the worst case scenario. The difference, though, here to me, I'm big into the Constitution and what our founders, how they intended, what role of government they intended. I'm so insistent that Congress do more on foreign policy because it was so clear in the writing of our documents and from our founders' perspective that they wanted Congress to be the main body declaring war and deciding foreign policy and just a president that carries it out. With some of this stuff, though, the founders never would have imagined the federal government being a mass employer in the realms of education and healthcare and so much else. So it's almost, I would say it's almost beyond the scope of what they comprehended our government would do. So it's a little bit more, I have less of a insistence that it be managed by Congress, even though I think that would be ultimately for the best, given that we have such a large government as an employer functioning at the way a large corporation does, to not give, at least in the same way that a CEO or managers have a lot of power to restructure the company, to not have our effective CEO have anything approaching that power, for the Supreme Court to say you have nothing approaching that power, seems to me like it's just going to be unworkable. Yeah,
I mean, look, I think that you do raise a very fair point about the growth of government in contemporary America versus what the founders envisioned. I mean, that's obviously vastly different. And so that, I think, is a valid point. But I get back to the point that Jackson raised in her ruling, which is this is going to have massive impacts on people who are currently employed by the federal government. At one stage, the VA was talking about laying off 30,000 people. In the face of criticism, they've now pulled back from that to about 10,000. There were also groups, of which the NIH was one, talking about another 10,000 people being laid off. These are things that neither the lower court nor the Supreme Court have decided are legal, because the argument is they may be such a fundamental restructuring that a president does not have the authority to do them. So that fundamental question of legality is up in the air. Meanwhile, we're allowing the layoffs to go ahead. So it's like, yeah, we can just cast these people out onto the unemployment line. We don't really know if it's legal or not, but let's see. That'll be decided at some later point.
Right, well, the Supreme Court is on some level showing its hand, or saying, we think this one's probably legal. Other things the Trump administration has decided to do, they've stopped, they've enjoyed. They said, we think this is probably not legal, but we'll check it later, but this is how we feel about it. I mean, they are splitting the baby on some of these things. I think the DOGE cuts to spending that were not rescinded by Congress are going to be reinstated. Some of the stuff Trump's done on immigration gets thrown out. But this is the Supreme Court saying, well, on this one, we think they probably do have this power.
Well,
so
we shall see.
You win some, you lose some, Niall.
That is certainly true. Elon Musk's chatbot, Grok, is going rogue, firing off a slew of anti-Semitic posts. We'll talk about that next.